Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're really excited about today's conversation about these beautiful geometric patterns. The patterns are often appear to be complex, yet can be produced with a simple ruler and a compass. Today, we are joined by Richard Henry and Adam Williamson, founders of the Art of Islamic Pattern, for a conversation that will take us inside the world of Islamic geometric art and also learn about their personal artistic journey. Richard and Adam are the two leading practitioners and teachers of this art. Richard has a background in philosophy and cognitive psychology and studied for 2 years under Professor Keith Critchlow, one of the world's leading authorities on the geometry of Islamic patterns. Richard has devised and taught courses on this subject for the British Museum in London. He is also a visiting lecturer at the Prince's School of Traditional Arts and various other renowned institutions. He has undertaken field studies in Turkey, Morocco, Iran, Syria, and Egypt. Richard teaches, lectures, and exhibits internationally. Welcome, Richard. Adam is a leading specialist on biomorphic art. He is also an award-winning calligrapher and sculptor. His clients include the Prince of Wales, Oxford University, the Foreign Council of Vienna, among others. Adam has traveled extensively all over the world to study with craftsmen of diverse backgrounds. He has given talks, workshops at many leading cultural institutions all over the world. Adam has participated in a number of solo and group exhibitions internationally. Welcome, Adam. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. We will have a 40 minutes of moderated panel discussion, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Please use the Q&A icon on your Zoom screen to send in your questions anytime during the panel. For those watching on Facebook, please feel free to submit your questions there. With that, I would like to turn it over to our moderator, Rifat, an artist herself and a student of Islamic geometric art. She has studied with both Richard and Adam.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Rifat, and I'll be your moderator. As an artist and a student of Islamic art, I'm really excited about today's session. My guests today are prominent artists and geometers, Adam Williamson and Richard Henry, joining us live from the UK. It's a pleasure having them here with us. Welcome. How are you both doing today?
We're delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting us to be involved in this.
Hello, everyone.
To begin our conversation today, I'll start with a few questions. Geometric patterns make up one of the three non-figural types of decoration in Islamic art, which also includes calligraphy and biomorphic patterns. You see these abstract designs adorning Islamic architecture on a monumental scale, as well as in a vast area of everyday objects from ceramics to textiles. So what makes Islamic geometric art so unique? Can you talk about its origins and the main components?
Go first.
Well, I think it's, for me, it's to do with the kind of ambience that it creates. The patterns themselves, they embody this sort of profound unity where all the elements are perfectly harmonized, and they seem to give us a kind of an insight into the almost like the organizing principles of matter on a very profound level. So you can see like geometry within sort of cellular structures, within sort of plant life and so on. So they're very intimately connected to this idea of creation and God's creation. And so I think that was why it's quite important in the early period of this, sort of the early centuries of Islam, to focus upon this particular area, because mathematics and mathematical forms were seen as a way of gaining an insight into the mind of God, to the ultimate creator. So I think there's always that sense within geometry, within Islamic geometric patterns, which sort of sets them apart.
Adam, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, all of these patterns, they weren't necessarily they didn't just necessarily appear. They've been around, they've been growing in other cultures, Byzantines, Nabateans. There are many different cultures which were adapted on and built on. So we're really seeing like a kind of a sort of a funneling in the Islamic period of all these different traditions that became absorbed into the Islamic Empire and really shone within these incredible palaces and mosques and madrasas. Yes.
So Richard, you studied philosophy and cognitive psychology and also worked as an analyst programmer. When did you realize that you have an inclination towards Islamic geometric art that led you to pursue it?
Well, it's quite a sort of long journey, really. I mean, as a child, my favourite subjects were mathematics and art, and all the other subjects in between I struggled with in school, and I didn't really know what that combination would necessarily lead me to, but I studied philosophy. Philosophy was the first thing I studied at university, and I was very interested in the ideas behind Platonic thought and the idea of the world unfolding from these kind of archetypal forms, and this idea of there being these eternal forms beyond sort of physical manifestation, and the idea that there's this sort of inversion of reality in a way. I mean, when we talk about the real these days, we're referring to the things which are physically manifest, but within the Platonic sense, the idea of the real were the things which were ideals, so principles and so on. And this was quite a sort of significant idea for me. And so I was very attuned to that. And also when I was a child, I was just very drawn to architecture, particularly sacred architecture across the traditions, initially with Victorian architecture and then with Gothic. But I was also aware of particularly the architecture of Sinan, the great Ottoman architect. And even as a child, I would see pictures of Istanbul. And I would see the mosques and minarets in profile across the sort of cityscape of the Bosphorus. And I had this very strong sense that this is somewhere that I wanted to go. And after university, I went and worked as an English language teacher in Istanbul. And that was the first time I'd spent time in a Muslim country. And I wasn't formally studying the architecture, but I had, I was documenting it photographically. And I was very, very, very moved by it. So, and then it just started to build from there. I started traveling through the Islamic world. I traveled out to sort of, out into Anatolia back then. And also in that same period, I lived in Spain. I went to the Alhambra. I got the boat over to Morocco. And I spent time in, going from Tangier. I traveled all over Morocco, but I was really struck by Fez. I visited Fez for the first time 30 years ago, and back then it was still very much a traditional culture. I mean, the only people you would see in Western dress would be the tourists, and it was, I couldn't believe that somewhere like that could still exist in the 20th century. It was just this sort of incredible window into the medieval world. You still had the traditional communal bakers there. There were still craftsmen in the street. I mean, it's changed quite a lot now, Fez, but it's still somewhere which remains, a kind of, I would say, a vestige of that living tradition of the crafts. And it's a place that both myself and Adam have been visiting quite regularly. It's one of our most popular sort of study trips over the last, well, when did we go there first? 2013, 7 years ago. Yeah, we did a bit of a reconnaissance mission there 7 years ago, and then we've been going ever since. So it's been a kind of interesting return over the last 10 years to these places which I visited 30 years ago. I'm kind of going back there as a kind of an ambassador for these sort of crafts and skills. Sorry, it was a long answer to a short question.
I know. No, that's wonderful. Adam, you come from a family of artists and craftsmen. Can you share with us your journey that led you to the study of the art?
Well, Yeah, I guess it's another long story, slightly different route. My father's a carpenter, and both my parents were Sufis, or, well, you're not really allowed to call yourself Sufi, but they were on the path. So I already had a sort of introduction to the kind of mystical side of Islam. But I started out in the arts and crafts. My dad was very much of the thinking that all of me, myself and my brothers had to have a skill which you could use as a kind of creative springboard for whatever field we wanted to work into. So I started out as a sign writer, and then a calligrapher, and I kind of moved through these different fields, trying to hone my skills, and also sort of trying to stay ahead of this sort of industrialization of the crafts, which is still happening to this day. I mean, there are renaissance in particular areas, but as I say, I started as a sign writer, and after a year of painting cafes and bookstores, these vinyl signage started to come in, and I had to change, and I found that I've had to keep like swapping hats to stay ahead of the mechanization of my chosen crafts. This, even with carving and later in life, there's all these new 3D printers and three-dimensional carving equipment that's coming into place, which makes it quite difficult. I mean, the only thing that's really keeping things alive or that is this human need for interaction, and that's done through handmade crafted items. And that's one of the things that we try to push in our classes. It's that handmade quality that resonates, and that's why people want to visit the Alhambra, these old buildings, because you learn so much just being in the presence of these this Malam's work, these masters' work. So you can not just see the proportions and feel the texture. There is a resonance, like an oscillation, which is basically the artist's intention, which is resounding in this work. And often within a sacred art, like Islamic art, the repetition of the process, you know, whether it's the hitting of the chisel with the mallet or the stroke of the brush, is often done with a zikr, with an inherent sort of sacred prayer. And that prayer is imbuing the work, and that's what you're witnessing when you're in these beautiful palaces. And that's what's raising your consciousness. So I was always interested in craft. I didn't really understand it in that way when I was younger, but I was drawn to it. I liked the process of just sitting and, you know, I kind of just prayed for projects that would take me months and months, so I could just stand in front of a stone and carve, or have a really intricate illumination that I could work through. But yeah, to go back to my story, I was, after calligraphy, part of my calligraphy class was illumination. And that's where I first got introduced to sort of book arts. And then I went to the British Library, and I was introduced to Quranic illumination. And then I also got in touch with Martin Lings, and through him, and he sent me a lot of his books and gave me a lot of encouragement. I started to kind of make further investigations. I found out about the Prince's School and ended up going there as an artist in residence because I was a bit too young to do the MA. And that was sort of my journey, discovery of you know, sort of journey into Islamic art. And then from then on, I found the best route to learn was to seek out masters to train with. And so I traveled to Malaysia, and I studied in Kelantan there, and I traveled to various countries around the world, looking for people to really, you could say, vibe off, because the real learning, and most craftsmen will tell you this, is actually just doing the drawings, doing the geometry over and over again, carving, painting. I mean, that's where the real education comes. But what you get from a master is this sort of, they're like a signpost, right? So you can't just stand by a signpost, but they'll give you this guidance. They'll send you off, you know, pack you with the right tools, whether that's the correct equipment or just the sort of the consciousness that's needed, and the kind of fire that is required to kind of undertake this work. So I've just been very privileged to be inspired by lots of amazing teachers, and our late teacher Keith Critchlow, who we both studied with, really he connected all of these different things. So often when you speak to craftsmen, whether they're wood carvers or painters, whoever they are, they all sort of speak the same language. But Keith was fantastic because he just kind of was like an umbrella, and he connected spirituality, craft, consciousness, all of these, science, mathematics. He kind of managed to, he's a real polymath, and join them all together under this umbrella of geometry. And it just made it a whole lot easier to approach things when you have all these disparate interests. Anyway, I can go on and on, but that's sort of how I got into Islamic art.
Okay, so since you bring renowned geometer, artist, and teacher Keith Critchlow, you talk about him. What was it like studying under his guidance? Like, can you share any stories that you are carry through as a teacher? Richard, would you like to go first?
Well, I think, there's so many things one could say about sort of Keith. I'm not quite sure where to begin. He was, I do think that without him, there wouldn't be this revival in Islamic art as a contemporary practice. I think all the people who are sort of, well, certainly within the sort of this geometric field, who are teaching or practicing, can all be traced back to him. They're all sort of either direct students of him, like myself and Adam, or they're sort of just or students of ours, or other people who've studied under him. He was, I think the real test of a teacher is whether they can actually create other teachers, and I think he was very much like that. We talk about people being teachers of teachers, but he really was that. And there was something in his approach which, there's many aspects. I think one of them is this, there was this sense of embodied learning. He was very keen to not just, even though he was, there was this very strong cerebral aspect and spiritual aspect to him, the process of embodiment was really important. So this sort of touches upon, what Adam was saying with the crafts, and doing things by hand from first principles was really, really significant. And I certainly think, with something like geometry, there's a tendency for people to think, well, it's mathematical, it's just patterns. We can do all this stuff in AutoCAD, we can just do it on a computer. But the actual process of actually going through the principles, and I think that's, just drawing these things by hand, it just ends up connecting into the body, and it becomes like this sort of meditation in the body, a kind of visual yoga, but it's not just visual, it's there within the hand. And he would talk a lot about the handling of the tools, and he would think about the role of the compass and how it sort of operates sort of spiritually as this. You have these two legs, one stays fixed, which represents the ontological axis, which links to the center, and there's this idea of tawheed, drawing everything back to the source. And then there's this moving leg of the compass, which is relating the exterior to the interior. So there's this, it has this dual aspect, and there's a lot of debate and controversy over how far back into the tradition one can trace that. But if one works in that way, there's a reality to the experience that is just undeniable when you start actually working with it. And I think that was the key to his teaching, and it's also the key to sort of the teaching of people like myself and Adam and other people who studied under Keith. I also thought there was this, particularly now in our sort of, especially the last 5-6 years within the whole sort of social media explosion, there's a lot of people doing Islamic geometric art now. And there's a real obsession with technique and technical aspects of them. And there's this, I think there's a danger, particularly, and this is one of sort of dangers of just taking these things online, of losing that connection to the physical process of doing things. I think, when I think back to Keith's teaching, and also one of our teachers, Paul Marchant, but more so with Keith, he wasn't actually teaching us geometry. Geometry was just a tool to teach something else. What he was teaching was ethics, so it would, he would give us quotes from various kind of Sufi figures, or it might be a hadith, or it could be something like from Meister Eckhart, or something, a saying from Buddhism. And these would be kind of, so the thing that he would be trying to imbue was this sort of sense of a kind of moral being. And the geometry is just a tool in order to engender that. So because the geometry embodies a kind of profound truth, then that truth relates to other levels of truth, you know. So it's not like you can't just separate mathematical truth from sort of ethical truth, you know. So, you know, you can't separate love from practice. And I think that was something which was very, very clear to him, and it came through very strongly in the teaching. It was something very, very profound, and it's something which is quite hard to sort of carry on through, but it's something that I sort of try to do in my work, and Adam as well, and I think other people who've studied under Keith. But it's quite a sort of subtle detail and what I would describe as a kind of mystical dimension to the teaching.
That was very insightful. You both work in different mediums to produce your work. How do you come up with the ideas when it comes to your compositions? Could you talk about your creative process? Adam, would you like to answer that first?
Yeah, sure. Well, it depends really, because much of my work for years was commissioned work. So I'd have a rough outline of what was required of me. But what I found was, my journey was always sort of strange, because I'd often have be interested in a particular pattern or a particular way of carving or something that I was really drawn to, and then I would get commissioned to do something very similar. So I found I've had this strange relationship with my career where I'm not entirely sure whether I'm manifesting it or at times not linear. But many of the projects, not just the sort of physical projects, carved projects, but also some of the projects working abroad with, those elements have been in dreams I've had or adventures that I've really hoped for in the future. And then often when I've forgotten about them, they would just manifest. So I had an interesting experience on that journey. But yeah, on a more practical process, like there will be, the commissioning process. I'll work with the client and then present them a series of ideas. As I said, they're often things that I'm working on at the time, so they sync quite nicely. And then there's a bit of backwards and forwards, and then the completion of the project. But I've gone, as I said before, I've had various careers. For a while, I was working as a calligrapher and a sign writer, and then for about 8 or 9 years, I worked as a stone carver, and then recently I've been working mostly sort of carving, making sculptures, but then doing a lot of this research into Islamic pattern and running these trips with Richard. So, yeah.
How about you, Richard? What is your creative process like?
The creative process. I think it's, it's interesting hearing Adam talk about the sort of commissioned work. I mean, I've relied a lot less on commissioned work. I struggle with that aspect because I'm not very good at co-creating with a client or sponsor, and so I think so if I did something nice, the person would say, well, can you do this thing, do these tiles, do them in a different color? And I'm like, well, that's not what it's telling me it wants to be. I feel that the work has its own destiny. In a way, that's why I like to be sort of professionally teaching mostly, because it means that within my own artistic work, I can allow the work to have its own telos, meaning its own sort of destiny. Because I think works kind of emerge and they're kind of separate from you, and you there, as an artist, you're one to sort of nurture and give birth to the work and witness it coming into being. And so, yeah, I think there's that sense of the numinous, coming through, a sense of the other world. I mean, I can remember, I think often, particularly with these designs, it can start with an abstract geometric pattern, which would just be sort of purely formal. But then as soon as you put it into a kind of medium, and I've worked in different things, in ceramic, also things in wood and stone, but most recently in sort of painting and collage. As soon as something comes into a sort of physical being, it's like witnessing the birth of something, and you are there to kind of like, you know, be in this sort of, you know, just this nurturer there. Yes, so, and often I find that it's, particularly with the geometry, it's certain things just become certain themes. Like I'll keep coming back to certain constructions, and it's like being in a kind of spiral structure where you keep coming back to the same point again, but when one's at a different place within the cycle. And so yeah, I mean, there's this sort of sense of a kind of repetition, which has a sort of ritual aspect to it, where you're back towards a design you've maybe looked at you haven't looked at for maybe 20 years, but it's kind of captivating you again, and you're kind of serving that work, I think, and bringing it into being in a particular way. So yeah, I don't know if that offers some kind of clarity.
No, that was wonderful. In classical or traditional arts, like such as calligraphy or the art of illumination, if one wants to study it in a traditional way, they have to find a master who grants them an ijaza after finishing a certain curriculum. Is there such a process for Islamic geometric art? And if so, what would it take for someone to reach that level of specialization?
The 10,000 hours, really. Yeah, I would say it's really the time that you put into it, because you know, you notice with people like Gia and students that we've had, you know, sometimes people, I hope she wouldn't mind me saying, but they start out like, you know, finding it a bit, they're sort of gradual at first, and then they just put in hours and hours and hours, and the shapes and the forms start to speak to you the more you reproduce a pattern, for example, over and over, and you get this understanding through doing it. I mean, the teacher can't stand over you and watch you the whole time. They can give you pointers, but I found, you know, with carving that, you know, I had like an initial, you know, few hundred hours with different carving teachers. And then the real learning came just getting into the studio at 8 a.m. and leaving at 10 p.m. and just carving all day. Making mistakes, being very slow, and then speeding up and understanding and really getting to grips with the material. Doing that for months and months, that was my real period of education, making all the mistakes you can make. So yeah, like there are different systems. I mean, I don't know, there isn't anyone around to offer hijazas for geometry at the moment. That's very much a sort of Turco-Persian tradition for calligraphy. And, yeah, I don't know. How about hijazas?
I haven't, not for geometry. I mean, traditionally, I don't think geometry was sort of seen as a kind of separate tradition that one would learn independently of other crafts.
It's part of every craft.
It's part of everything, really. Yes, so there isn't, I don't know, I mean, I think as Adam says, everybody has a kind of individual path, but there's always this, you do have to put in the time. I mean, I think about my own sort of thing with this, you know, when I was first studying this very seriously, which is 20 years ago now. I mean, I would just be in the studio at the school just from the moment it opened till they sort of threw us out in the evening. And it would just be, I would just not sleep at nights, just doing certain patterns, and just, you know, you become enslaved to that process, but, you know, in a positive way. But you would find, I don't know, it does affect your state when you're contemplating these forms. You know, you can forget to eat, you can, you know, and it's interesting because I start seeing this process happening in some of our students. You know, I see the work they do, and I think, how long did you spend on this? It's like, you know, it's like that someone will just spend, you know, 150 hours over a very short period just working on these designs, because particularly with these sort of more complex designs, you know, they'll go and weave them and then render them in color, and you think, wow, this is just extraordinary. Just from, I mean, I'll give a 2-hour class, and then someone will go away and work on it for, you know, a few hundred hours and come back with this extraordinary work. And I think, well, you know, that's just incredible. But that is the process that you go through. You know, you kind of well, it's like anything, you know, any sort of, you know, whether it's music, you kind of have to you kind of have to want to do it, you know, it's just, you don't really have a choice, you know.
And that's the gift, right?
Yeah.
That's the talent. That's
yeah.
So it just comes down to hard work and dedication, I suppose.
Yeah, but also,
you want to craft.
But people are different. Some people progress at different rates, and you know, some people have more of a sort of predisposition, but at the end of the day, it just has to be something which becomes this kind of core and focus for you.
Yeah, because people often ask that, you know, but you have talent, and I think that like some people have a natural aptitude to it. I mean, I'm quite dyslexic, so I find like I have an interesting relationship with symmetry, and I can see things quite quickly. But other than that, I feel like it's just the time, and I have this burning passion to see a project through and to really get involved, and I want to be doing it above all things. So especially when I was younger, so that's the gift or the curse. But yeah, like once you've got that bug, then there's only one result, because you want to see it and you want to embody it and be involved in it, and it's your meditation, your practice. Yeah, and there's no end to it really. It's a practice.
Since the lockdown, you've been taking these amazing online classes that have given opportunity to a global community of learners of Islamic art. How does this experience inform your teaching methods, and what is next for the Art of the Islamic Pattern?
You want me to? Yeah, well, I mean, for myself, the online classes were just a sort of spontaneous reaction to the situation we're in, and it's probably the same for Rich, I guess. We just wanted to give, you know, to share in a different way, and we tried it out. We've been reluctant to do online classes. As Richard said, we like to just teach people in person, and we're willing to travel all over the world to do that. So we've been holding back all this time, and then it was just a sort of perfect situation. Everyone's locked away, and so we just sort of started sharing all of this, all of our resources and information, and it's been an amazing response, right? A huge global community, lots of people who couldn't have afforded to or couldn't have traveled to our classes managed to come together, and then they have something to focus on in between the classes, producing incredible works, like Richard said. So it's quite spontaneous. And myself and Richard, we've been, you know, the whole Art of Islamic Pattern experience has really been responding to demand and just following our strengths and interests. So it's not like, none of it's really been planned. It's quite organic with the study trips, with everything we've done from the very first classes. So this is just this, yeah, we don't know what the future will be. We hope we'll start running trips again, but we're just, yeah, kind of going with the flow, being of service.
Are you working on any upcoming projects?
Well, it's very difficult, right, in the creative fields, because there's so much uncertainty. And for what we do, we need like long running times for these trips. A lot of people have to travel from, you know, around the globe. And so we're going to see. We're willing to travel, but we have to watch the news.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the arts community sort of beyond us certainly has been really affected by this. I mean, there were, you know, a number of exhibitions which were sort of scheduled for this year, and all of that has kind of just been either cancelled or delayed. And that's usually the way in which I kind of motivate myself to produce or finalise new work, is to kind of have a deadline for an exhibition. So that's sort of, that's kind of changed the whole dynamic of things. I mean, I'd always said, people have been asking us for years, will we do classes online? And I'd always said no. You know, I always direct them to other people, like some of our students who've run online courses, because I think we learn through teachers directly, and you know, the living presence of the teacher is quite important to us. We see this as a kind of form of transmission and so on. So if it had not been for this situation, I mean, I don't think we would have got around to doing this, because it's not, people have been asking us to do this for like 15 years, you know, But then having done it, you realize, well, actually, it does have its advantages. You know, there are things that you can achieve online, you know, certainly, you know, as you say, in terms of access to students, to people who wouldn't have been able to do it. And people just seem to really value it, you know, so we feel like, you know, it's, you know, we are being positive service. I mean, I had done bits of online teaching before with other institutions, but not necessarily related to the like to art practice. I taught, you know, I taught humanities courses with universities in London, and that was a very, very different experience from actually teaching people to work with the physical process within their own home. And I wouldn't have anticipated it working, but it does, you know. And obviously there's disadvantages in that I can't go around and monitor what people are doing, but then it has its advantages in that you can actually, on the screen, it's very easy to really sort of clearly demarcate and show what you're doing, take people through the stages. And we're recording everything, so we can sort of make a kind of, you know, a kind of package where people can then sort of go back and revisit the classes. And so there's lots of things so it has its, you know, it's like anything, there's a sort of trade-off. But, you know, it's, I mean, I think it's something that we will continue doing now, not just for this period, and it'll be something which runs alongside, you know, the face-to-face teaching, which will never stop as far as we're concerned.
It's a kind of different form of collaboration, I think, because when you're in the class, when we're on a trip, you know, all our students are obviously really interesting characters, and there's a real unit that grows over 5 days. You know, from Morocco, for example, you know, people group together and then add, you know, there's an addition to our teaching. People are bringing their enthusiasm and different elements. So at the beginning of when we started running the classes, I found that quite difficult because you're sort of generating all the energy. But then what I found is when you start seeing the results, like a few weeks later, when people, like Richard said, have spent hours painting the patterns, and you see what's happening behind the scenes, there's a different kind of interaction, and that's really motivating to see this. You know, it's very different from a class, but the results were incredible, and they make you feel like it's all worthwhile. Yeah, putting in that effort.
What advice would you give to aspiring students?
Well, just go back to, I mean, what we were saying earlier, you know, it's really just putting in the time, doing the research, finding, you know, there's lots of teachers out there now, so just getting a real cross-section of ideas, and there's a lot of literature. I find that, you know, repeating patterns is a great way to learn, not just drawing one and then moving on to something else, but just drawing and drawing and drawing. Whether it's geometry or biomorphic, you start to get a better understanding of how things line up, and a relationship with the shapes themselves, which is a real education.
Okay. I think now we have a couple of questions coming in from our online viewers. I think we'll be taking them now. So the first question that we have is, what makes traditional Islamic art feel relevant in the present day, and where do you see the tradition going in the coming years?
How is it relevant in the modern day? Well, I think it's dealing with things which are, you know, aspects of the eternal, you know, so these are sort of very, very beautiful harmonic relationships, and I see the geometry as a kind of visual music, and you know, there's a kind of depth of beauty within that, which doesn't really go out of fashion, really. I mean, I think we could regard what we're involved in here as a kind of a revival of an art form, but each time an art form is revived, it sort of mutates and responds to the kind of the context in which it's reborn. So I think it remains relevant, because we're not just sort of copying designs. We're very interested in the kind of generative principles behind these patterns. So it's not just a case of reproducing historical things, but trying to sort of get to that sort of the essential, the originary principles underneath them. And I think if we're able to touch that, then I think that means that it becomes this sort of very sort of, this sort of well stream of inspiration.
Okay. Our next question from our audience is, okay, so what is your opinion on non-traditional methods of construction, that is digital, example digital, using stencils, etc.? Do you think it takes away from the integrity of the art form? Adam, would you like to answer that?
Oh no, I wouldn't like to answer. Well, I mean, obviously I have a bias. I have had certain things made for me with computers. I think that if you could have some hand interaction at some stage in production, that will make a difference, whether it's drawing and then that drawing is vectored, and then, but if it's all drawn and then mechanically carved or produced, I find that there's something, it's difficult to interact with it. I can admire the complexity and it could be very clever use of this and that, but if I personally connect with things that have some human connection to it, so that's my bias. But
Yeah,
obviously,
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there's something. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who are very, very skilled on the computer, and there's been work that people are doing, contemporary work, where I just think, wow, that is just quite extraordinary, and it's kind of work which could probably only be done drafting-wise on a computer. It would take just so long to do by hand. But at the same time, I can. It could be just a basic student who does a very simple drawing, or even a child does a drawing and there's a by hand and it's not even or something, but it's got this vibration there, and I just find that more moving, really. It just touches me more. I mean, I don't object to people using a computer. I mean, I think it'd be crazy not to. I mean, it's a useful tool, but I agree there still needs to be this sense of a human sensibility present in the work. I've seen so much really bad work, bad geometry done on a computer where people just they misunderstand a pattern, they just kind of Photoshop it, they kind of just stick it together and it's just some random piece. And it can look quite nice if you're skilled in Photoshop or something, but it's not really honoring this tradition, really. It's something else and it can be enjoyable on its own terms. But it's not engaging deeply with the source of these designs. That's my sense. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting debate, and people have quite different opinions on this. But I think the success of what we do is just trying to get back to doing things by hand, working with traditional materials. And everybody now is doing things digitally. So they're not. We've lost. People don't really cook anymore or sew, or even, I don't know, when I was growing up, my dad would repair his own car and stuff, and people have lost that connection to the whole process of the human being as a maker, and they're doing things they're just consuming digital images, and this has even become even more extreme in the last 5 to 7 years with social media. And when we do these things by hand and slow people down, it acts as a kind of very important meditation and also an antidote to this kind of form of disembodied consumption, which is what we're dealing with in terms of late capitalism and consumption of art. So, yeah, on one level, you could say it's kind of irrelevant what we're doing, but we provide a kind of an antidote to a tendency, which I think is actually quite inhuman. So we act at least as a kind of counterpoint to that, and maybe there can be a kind of a dialogical process whereby you combine work by hand and then you kind of return to the work by computer, and you do it in both ways. And the computer is not going to supplant the human element. I mean, there was the arts and crafts movement in the sort of 19th century, and that was a reaction against, Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, but there was a kind of a counteraction against that, and that would often be seen pejoratively. They'd be called people Luddites and so on, but there's they were onto something. You know, you can think of someone like William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, which gave base, you know, which then led to people like Edward Johnson, the revival of kind of well, Latin calligraphy in the UK, and also kind of traditional crafts and people like Eric Gill and so on.
It's the process, right? As well, it's the experience.
Yeah, I mean, the human being is a Homo faber, the man, the tool maker. That's one of the sort of terms. That was actually something which Keith taught us. You know, he would use that expression. That's one of the fundamental aspects of what it is to be a human being, is that you're a tool maker. So you're there to bring things into being. And the great sort of Moroccan sort of historian, Ibn Khaldun, who was like a very sort of way ahead of his time in the Maghrib, would give a kind of an analysis of historical, well, he would talk about the different sort of caliphates and the progression of those, and how different sort of cultures would go into decline and be reborn. But he would always talk about the importance of the crafts within any kind of revival of a tradition, or within any kind of sustaining of a culture. And for him, the most important craft, interestingly, was midwifery. So literally sort of witnessing the birth of a human being.
I think we probably have time for one more question from our audience. So our next question is, how much of mathematical knowledge is needed to decode the Islamic design patterns?
It's your turn, Adam. Well, we're not trained mathematicians. I don't think you need it, really. It is a mathematical form, and I do work, I've done lots of collaborations with mathematicians, but you do need spatial understanding, but people can have that without an understanding of the number and the mathematics. I try and bring in those elements for people who want them, but if people don't want that aspect, they don't need to learn it. And we weren't taught that way from, our teachers, Keith Critchlow and Paul Marchant. And as I've said before, I don't think this revival of Islamic geometric art would have taken place without them. I don't know, but that's just my hunch. And it was to do with this kind of more embodied approach to working with the fundamental tools of the craft. So yeah, we do get lots of mathematicians who join the classes, which I often find quite intimidating, actually, because I see them on the list and I think, my goodness, this is a guy who supervises PhDs in geometry. Why is he coming to learn from us? And yet, even people at a very, very high level, they still want to have this connection. They've lost that connection to the kind of physical process of embodiment of the patterns. You don't need advanced mathematics to do that. But again, like the computer, it's something which you can have a dialogue with and it can kind of come into it, but it's not an essential element, I wouldn't say.
Okay. It seems like we can take a few more questions. Our audience are very eager. Okay, so the next question is, there are probably millions of geometric designs that can be made following the ground rules through not necessarily unrepeatable, but can an artist really claim a copyright to his or her design?
It's controversial. Yeah,
can of worms.
Yeah, I always feel funny when people watermark their work, and I feel like it's quite nice that just to share and to experience it, and it's just like a collective pool of understanding. So we're all in this big collaboration, like Bernard Deschartres was saying. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants, like working from previous efforts that have been made, for the last 1,000 years. We're using tools that have been crafted and engineered by people who came before us, and the same with these patterns. So I think it should just all be a celebration, and then I feel like that's sort of the way it is mostly with this year's kind of explosion of this art form, that most people just really happy to share the work and and see it as a collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
if it's your living, you've got to make artwork, and then you've got to sell it, and you've got those issues. And obviously, we both have, I've had many sculptures that have been replicated in various ways in different countries, and it's up to you how you respond to that. But I'm quite honoured when I see that.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, it's a sort of form of flattery, isn't it, if people are copying you? I mean, I think there is it's difficult now because I think it's fine to use things as long as you're honest about the sources of them, and acknowledging those. And I think this is why people put watermarks on pieces, because particularly now, because it's so easy to copy stuff. I mean, one of our students, Margie Lake, who does these, she spends hours and hours on these designs, very, very finished pieces. And then it's like somebody just grabs it off the internet, goes and sticks it on a scarf and then starts selling it. And I think, well, this is just unethical behavior, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, is it ignorance, or are people just genuinely malevolent, or what, I do think there has to be a kind of an acknowledgement of sort of the sources of work, and it's
what
a very
the original craftsman theory.
Exactly, yeah.
So it goes back and back. I mean, that's the lovely thing about sacred art back in medieval period, that people weren't leaving their names on them back then. They're just happy to be, involved in venerating the divine and adding to being a part of building a cathedral or a mosque. And it was sort of simple approach until the Renaissance.
Yeah.
So our final question from our online viewers. Are there any philosophers or writers that have greatly influenced you, both Richard and Adam?
I think I was very interested I was introduced to the sort of philosophers of the perennial school by Keith Critchlow when I was at the school, and I hadn't come across those before. So people like Said Hussein Nasser and Titus Burckhardt, and I enjoy their writings. René Guénon, Martin Lings, who Adam had some connections with, so yeah, those were quite important figures. Henri Corbin is a difficult writer, but he's written on sort of Persian Sufism and extraordinary writings, very, very difficult to penetrate, but he was quite important. And then before getting into this field, I was very interested in, as I mentioned before, Platonic thought and also Pythagorean ideas, and those still sort of influence my sort of relationship to this art practice.
And what about you, Adam?
For me, I'd say I read Gurdjieff's book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, when I was a teenager, and it just came at a really pivotal time for me, because he was a sort of searcher, and just hearing about how he went about not just finding masters, but getting by in life, and his sort of pluck and use of craft and ingenuity, and his sort of the way he balanced his work ethic with a sort of spiritual life really inspired me. So that was my most inspirational read when I was a 17-year-old, and really turned my life around. And just the way he was able to move and be flexible and use discipline to be creative, but also be a sort of spiritual searcher, and the way he combined those elements. So I'd say that was the most inspirational book. And then, like Richard said, really part of the Prince's School's ethos was looking into these perennial writers. And I kind of vibed with Eric Gill and Kurswami and Titus Burckhardt, and some of them more simple craft-based philosophical approaches. Corbin and Guénon were always a little bit more. You need a philosophy degree like Richard to really engage with those guys. I was more, yeah, I'm like all about the process and the craft, and anyone who speaks in that language, it's easy for me to access. So that's my journey.
Well, that was very insightful. I think that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Adam and Richard, for this enriching and inspiring conversation. It's been a pleasure having you with us.